Well, welcome. It's so great to have everyone here joining us today. My name is John Alfuth, and I am the Director of State Policy at KnowledgeWorks. KnowledgeWorks is a national nonprofit based in Cincinnati, Ohio, and our organization helps schools, districts, and states advance student-centered learning policy in practice. We do this by providing direct supports to schools and districts that are seeking to make shifts in how they operate, supporting state policymakers who are seeking to create the conditions for schools and districts to successfully create student-centered systems, evaluating the impact of these systems, and helping envision what a student-centered future can look like. We have a couple other folks also from KnowledgeWorks and ECS, so I'll now hand it off to my colleague, Emily, to introduce herself.
Awesome. Thanks, John. I'm Emily Brixey, and I'm a Senior Manager of Policy, Advocacy, and Research here at KnowledgeWorks. As part of my role at KnowledgeWorks, I've taken the lead in developing and utilizing our new state tracking system. And prior to joining KnowledgeWorks, I did policy research and tracked bills at Education Commission of the states. So it's a pleasure to be joined on today's webinar by one of my former colleagues, Ben. Ben, I'll pass it off to you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Education Commission of the states.
Thanks, Emily. My name is Ben Erwin, and I'm a policy analyst with Education Commission of the states, where I support our policy work on a number of issues, including personalized competency-based learning. Education Commission of the States is a national education policy organization that has been serving state policymakers in all 50 states and the District of Columbia for nearly 60 years. We're nonpartisan, unbiased, and cover the full spectrum of education issues from early learning through post-secondary in the workforce. Using what we know about state trends and approaches from across the country, we aim to help policymakers make informed decisions about what might work in their state. We do this in a variety of ways, through research, publishing reports, hosting convenings, and providing counsel. We research and report on trending education topics and are often invited to talk with groups just like this one to share how states are approaching specific education issues and offer ideas for states to consider.
Thank you so much, Ben. And again, it's great to have the privilege to partner with you and ECS on this exciting opportunity. So before we jump in, we just want to do a couple of take a couple minutes to do some framing around the content that you're going to hear from Emily and Ben today. So this webinar is really grounded in work for us that began last summer. Emily and Ben are really going to dig into the details on the legislative pieces, but before they do, I'm really going to touch on two pieces, the why and the what of why we decided to create this system. So even before the pandemic, it was, I think, clear to most of us, if not all of us on this webinar, that existing K-12 education systems and structures really weren't working for too many of our students and across the country. We've seen, on one hand, historically high graduation rates these past few years, 84% in one of the most recent years where we pulled data from. And at the same time, too many students aren't graduating ready for what comes next, whether it be remediation rates in college or businesses telling the country that students aren't graduating with the competencies they need to be successful in the world of work. In recent months, we've also seen story after story telling us that both students and parents believe that our education systems need to do a better job of preparing students for a successful future. And this is one of the core reasons why we created this tracking system. We wanted to make sure that we had a better handle on all of the legislative changes that were occurring across the country. So we will hope that this will be beneficial not only to our work, but that it will also be useful to the broader student-centered learning community, as well as those outside of that particular sector whose work crosses over with some of our focus areas, such as social emotional learning or college and career pathways. Now, before passing things off to Ben and Emily to dig into our trends, I just want to do a quick definition setting to make sure that we're clear about what we're talking about when we refer to this thing that we call personalized competency-based learning. This is a term that we use at KnowledgeWorks, and it encompasses two interconnected concepts. The first piece of it, personalized component, refers to the importance of creating engaging learning experiences that are customized to each student's strengths and interests. And then the competency-based piece refers to a system that advances students to higher levels of learning once they demonstrate competency of skills. And this is regardless of where they might be or the time that they may be needing to take to do this. So in working with states, we have combined these into a single term, personalized competency-based learning. Now, we also acknowledge that this is not the only term that's used out there and that there's a number of other ways that different states and organizations refer to these types of practices. You can see some of the more common definitions on the screen here. So throughout today's webinar, you're probably going to hear us refer to personalized competency-based learning, student-centered learning, as well as many of these other terms. We fully acknowledge that there are differences that exist between them across the states, and simply for the purposes of our webinar today, we just want to let you know that generally we're treating them as interchangeably with one another just for the sake of simplicity. So with that, I am now going to hand things over to Ben and Emily, who are going to get into the meat of our webinar today. Emily, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, John. So as I mentioned, part of my role at KnowledgeWorks involves overseeing the development and use of our legislative policy tracker. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I was part of the bill tracking team at Education Commission of the States prior to joining KnowledgeWorks. So first, let me outline some of the similarities between our two tracking systems. So first, both systems use databases that scan legislation across all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Both systems also leverage search strings and legislative tracking tools to help narrow the field of bills that then enables us to tag relevant bills to the appropriate area to help keep our data organized. While Education Commission of the States has been tracking for many years, this is a pretty new endeavor for KnowledgeWorks, at least formally. Ben, did Education Commission of the States start tracking in like the mid-90s, I think?
Yeah, we've changed our methodology some in the last decade, but the organization has education policies across the P20 spectrum available for people to view on our website from as early as 1996. I'll go ahead and drop a link to the ECS Education Policy Tracker in the chat for anyone who doesn't know about it.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. So as John mentioned, the reason that KnowledgeWorks wanted to develop another education policy and tracking system is that we wanted to create a system that would specifically address the needs of the student-centered learning community. While the Education Commission of the States tracker includes many different areas that address personalized competency-based learning policy, we wanted to create a more tailored tracking system based on KnowledgeWorks' state policy framework. And I will also paste that into the chat right now for anyone who might not be familiar with it. So our policy framework is unique in that it includes 12 policy conditions specific and necessary for supporting personalized competency-based learning. When we developed this framework, we drew on research from across the student-centered learning field and ultimately ended up with the 12 policy conditions in 4 strategy areas that you see here. You'll notice that these policy conditions include a wide range of issues, and this is because personalized competency-based learning doesn't simply give schools flexibility to pursue innovation, but it also includes policies to help them create a fully personalized learning environment. So it includes things like quality learning frameworks, the ability to assess mastery, legal and funding flexibilities for schools, the creation of structures to empower student voice and choice, and assessment and accountability, among other things, some of which we're going to touch on during our trends presentation today. So in some policy areas, we cast a wider net than Education Commission of the States, or sometimes we group policy tags together into one that they keep separate. In other policy areas, we cast a narrower net, more focused on student-centered learning tools. So let me give you a couple examples. Here are a couple of images showing what this looks like. First, we examine assessments differently. Education Commission of the States tracks almost everything related to education assessments. While at KnowledgeWorks, and we think the student-centered learning community more generally, is interested in a smaller subset of assessment policies that includes changes to support comprehensive or more balanced student assessment models. I think another great example of this, of where our tracking systems differ, is across the finance tag. And mostly what's interesting is that we track a lot of the same bills, but KnowledgeWorks focuses on finance bill tags that are specific to personalized competency-based learning. And we look for changes in both the funding formula as well as line item appropriations. So for those who enjoy a nice visual metaphor, it sort of ends up looking like this Venn diagram with a good number of bills being tracked by both organizations, but why we track them and how we summarize them take on different shapes. Does that kind of sound right to you, Ben? Did I do an okay job there?
Yes, it does. And I think one of the things I've really enjoyed about preparing for this webinar is that we've gotten to do a lot of cross-checking on our bill tracking. I think both of our organizations were able to flag bills for each other that we might not have, that we may have otherwise missed. Since we use different search strings and also have different state partners who keep us in the loop on different amendments and carryover bills, it was really helpful to compare notes.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Ben. I think it's been really helpful for me, especially, and it's always a pleasure working with ECS. So in summation, for general education policy tracking questions and curiosities, Education Commission of the States has so much information available to you. And for questions specific to student-centered learning, KnowledgeWorks hopes to be your first stop. At KnowledgeWorks, we are in the process of developing this new tracking system that we soft launched this year and will hopefully roll out more publicly next year to support the student-centered learning community. But I think we've done enough chit-chatting about our trackers, and I think that it is about time to get into the trends. Ben, will you walk our audience through the trends that we identified and will be covering today?
Absolutely. So the ECS legislative tracking system identified nearly 50 bills addressing personalized competency-based learning explicitly in the 2022 legislative session. But countless others captured in our tracking fall under the umbrella of personalized competency-based learning.
Exactly. Ben, if it helps at all, oh, I'm so sorry. I am having trouble hearing you. Hang on. I just wanted to flag that sorry, my internet's cutting in and out. Ben, can you keep going on this section?
Yeah, absolutely. We can move on to just the overview of what we're going to talk about today. So our collective bill tracking might really helped us to determine that states considered and enacted legislation to offer new options to assess student mastery, to alter state funding formulas or establish student-centered grant programs, to create learning pathways to prepare students for an evolving workforce, to support equitable student recovery and opportunities, and to create space for schools and districts to pursue innovative instructional delivery models. So now that we've covered the trends, we're going to get into the weeds on what some of these key trends were. So to start with, as accountability systems come back into effect, state policymakers are considering ways to provide students, schools, and districts with meaningful options for assessing mastery of academic content, or what we're referring to here as assessment of mastery. While some states have created space for demonstrations of mastery to earn course credit or satisfy graduation requirements, others are considering their assessments employed or reconsidering their assessments employed for state and federal accountability purposes. Accountability and assessment is definitely an issue to keep an eye on heading into 2023 as states continue to rework their systems to adjust to a changing education landscape. So here are a few bills that stood out this session. We'll start with Maine, since they look specifically at assessing student mastery of course content and graduation requirements. The state legislature introduced a significant amount of flexibility in their graduation requirements through legislation that adds applied learning programs as an accepted mode of instruction. The legislation permits students to demonstrate mastery of coursework requirements through exams, quizzes, portfolios, projects, and community service, while also adding an approved CTE program as a pathway to graduation. This change gives schools more flexibility in awarding credit for graduation, while also opening the door for students to demonstrate their own mastery in new and innovative ways. Both Florida and Virginia took a different tack by examining their statewide assessment system used for accountability purposes. In Virginia, the legislature enacted 2 bills to review state assessments and make recommendations to the legislature. The first bill directs the state superintendent and state board to convene a work group to revise the state summative assessment and develop an innovative assessment plan. The plan must include a pilot program for the 27-28 school year, sample assessment items, recommended legislative and regulatory changes, and a proposed timeline for implementation. Similarly, the other bill directs the state superintendent and state board to establish a working group to make recommendations to the legislature for expanding diploma options, prioritizing growth in grade level proficiency and school accountability, and improving the state accountability system more generally. These work groups will explore the interplay of assessment and accountability, and it could lead to the development of a more responsive assessment system. While Virginia is studying the issue, the Florida legislature directed an overhaul of their state assessment system. Under the bill, the State Department of Education will modify Florida's statewide standardized assessment program to include a screening and progress monitoring tool in ELA and math, in addition to a summative assessment used for accountability ratings. The bill aims to create this tool so teachers and parents get actionable feedback to tailor instruction and identify supports for students. These assessment changes may lead to more alignment between formative and summative assessments that better inform educators and parents in supporting their students. And it also aligns with this emerging trend and this emerging state focus on the importance of actionable assessment data for schools and communities. Some states have started implementing more personalized approaches to assessments that present options for other states. I know Emily has a few resources from her and her colleagues at KnowledgeWorks that touch on some of these efforts.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I would be remiss to not share these really great assessment and accountability papers that we put together. Okay, so transitioning over to one of my favorite topics now and a usual suspect in legislative trends, funding. So funding is obviously a critical component to successfully providing education services, and funding levels impact nearly every inch of education service delivery. Providing new funding or shifting existing funding in a way that supports personalized competency-based learning can signal a systemic change and is an important area of movement necessary for the success of student-centered learning. So in examining education funding from a personalized competency-based learning lens, we look for policies that support responsive funding systems. And these are systems that KnowledgeWorks identifies as showing evidence for supporting adequate, equitable, and flexible funding and resource systems that enable educators to advance personalized learning and address educational inequities. And while we saw a lot of really great pieces of legislation this session that did just that, these are a few of our favorite examples. First, in New Jersey, recently enacted legislation provides grants to support districts in implementing school-based programs and practices that promote mental wellness, social and emotional learning, and student resilience. Student health has been a trending topic for the last few years, even before the global pandemic, but the importance of addressing whole child needs was prevalent across both of our tracking systems this year, and funding for services to support these needs and programs is critical. Next, Utah passed a bill in a series of bills related to the innovation program, which Ben is going to touch on in a little bit. But this bill specifically established and funded that program. And for any audience members who crave a little bit of that detail, it appropriates $2.5 million to the State Board of Education to provide grants to support the additional costs related to the innovation program. So while grants and line items appropriations are essential components to school finance, the state funding formula is really what creates the base level of funding for schools and can be instrumental in establishing an equitable, responsive funding system. The funding change to Vermont's formula that was enacted this year gives additional funding weight to students from low-income backgrounds and students learning English as a second language. It also includes a categorical grant program for schools with between 1 and 5 English language learners. And selfishly, I just wanted to talk about a funding formula change because I love big changes like this. So like I said, there were a lot of really unique funding bills this session. Another one that didn't quite make the cut was California's bill, which appropriates money to support the development of LGBTQ+ cultural competency trainings. And at KnowledgeWorks, we've been flagging any line items that support personalized competency-based learning, even simple line items for mastery-based learning or proficiency-based learning. And I'll just say that some of the work that Education Commission of the states has been doing in the last couple of years in the school finance space has been really informative.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Our school finance team has also been tracking state policy movement, and they recently released an especially relevant paper on student counts and state funding, which has really been a trend that has emerged in the last couple of years. They used our 50 state comparison of K-12 funding and special education funding to inform this brief as well. But now to move on to learning pathways. In addition to personalizing funding and assessment, state legislators are prioritizing the development of new student pathways to graduation that address students' unique skills, interests, and needs. In some cases, state leaders are supporting engagement between schools and community, post-secondary, and workforce partners, while other policymakers are supporting the development of the skills needed to succeed in an evolving labor market. In Emily and I's home state of Colorado, the legislature appropriated funding to support the expansion of post-secondary options for students through the creation of the post-secondary workforce, career, and education grant program within the Department of Ed. This grant program provides funding to districts to better support students and families in developing career and education plans for after high school, and to increase the number of students completing FAFSA. It's always a mouthful. The legislation also provides for regional post-secondary and workforce coordinators to inform school staff of post-secondary options and financial aid opportunities, so they're better equipped to support students. Nebraska, on the other hand, focused specifically on developing 21st century skills through the Computer Science and Technology Education Act. This bill requires each school district to include computer science and technology education in the instructional program of its elementary and middle schools, and it requires each high school student to complete a computer science course prior to graduation. And we've seen more and more states adopt this additional course requirement for graduation. To assist schools, the State Board of Education is developing computer science standards that will live within the state's STEM standards. Lastly, we'll touch on Tennessee. So Tennessee established the Industry 4.0 diploma specifically for students to pursue work-based learning or dual enrollment options aligned with a specific career pathway. The legislation permits students to satisfy certain academic requirements through work-based learning or dual enrollment, and it also requires students pursuing an Industry 4.0 diploma to meet monthly with a qualified career coach who will help the student in developing successful workforce traits, applying for dual enrollment grants, identifying work-based learning opportunities, as well as dual enrollment and internship opportunities, and preparing for the standardized assessments they would need to earn their credential or move on to post-secondary education. These pathways help to facilitate successful student transitions to whichever post-secondary option a student chooses. And each policy highlights the importance of continuous support and strategic and personalized planning that involves students and families in the process. A major obstacle to successful transitions for students can be inequitable access to high quality educational experiences and supports. Emily is going to tell us a little bit more about state efforts to address some of these inequities.
Yeah, that's a great point, Ben. I think that part of what is so important about the work of the student-centered learning community is that addressing educational inequities is sort of like the North Star of the work. And it's something that state legislatures cared a lot about this session too, which is how it ended up on our trending topics list. So the list of state examples was long, but we picked out a few that we thought showed really the breadth of topics covered by states in this area. So in Maine, recent legislation establishes a high impact tutoring grant program and instructs the commissioner to prioritize grant awards to students from low income backgrounds or underserved students to address unfinished learning loss. It also specifies that tutoring plans should include interim assessments to address student progress. These types of programs are one policy lever for states to address the unfinished learning experienced by students during the large waves of the COVID-19 pandemic. Adding an equity lens to prioritize students who would most greatly benefit from these types of services is a way to use funds both efficiently as well as equitably. The Nebraska legislature passed another great example of how student health and wellness was a central focus for legislatures this year. The bill requires school districts to designate one or more behavioral health points of contact for each school building. It specifies that each behavioral health point of contact should coordinate access to community behavioral health services for students and families, and facilitates access to services during the school day at the school that the student attends. The bill also states that the Division of Behavioral Health of the Department of Health and Human Services is responsible for providing each school district with a registry of state and local behavioral health resources available to work with students and their families. And one final example for this section is another great example of how Education Commission of the States' tracking system captures a really wide range of policy issues. So this isn't something that we would have caught as part of our tracking system in KnowledgeWorks, but it's a really strong example of creating educational equity for students. And that's in Washington, where the state passed a bill that creates requirements for meetings between Washington state schools and tribal councils in order to support Native students in the state. Participants of meetings are encouraged to, among other things, work to emphasize the importance of creating an inclusive educational environment where all Native students will receive educational resources and supports to have the opportunity to succeed in pursuing their educational goals. Meetings must include discussions of Native student identification, tribal consultation training, data sharing, and consultations between individual school boards and federally recognized tribes. Now I'll pass it off to Ben to cover some policies related to flexibility and innovation.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, so personalized instruction can also support equitable student recovery, and schools and districts are often best situated to meet the individual needs of students and tailor instruction to address their interests and aspirations. A number of states have carved out flexibilities for schools and districts in governance or seat time policies that may allow for differentiated pacing or innovative instructional models. A primary approach used by policymakers has been to create a policy framework for innovation schools, which allow schools or groups of schools to apply for flexibilities from state statute or regulation. States can use a variety of mechanisms to do this, including by establishing structures like innovation zones or waiver processes. Typically, these policies require state or district level approval of innovation plans that clearly articulate the goals of the innovation and the strategies used to meet those goals. We're going to take a closer look at a few bills that took interesting approaches to allowing local innovation. So first, Arizona continued to expand options for local flexibility and innovative instructional models. In 2021, the legislature created a policy framework for districts to operate an alternative instructional time model with local approval while still maintaining the current state funding levels, which can be a concern at times, especially around how seat time is defined and other different quirks in the funding system. The legislation identified multiple alternative instructional models, including project-based learning, mastery-based education, or remote instruction. This year's bill permits schools to offer an alternative education program that uses one of these models on a different schedule, including on weekends or in the evenings, rather than during the traditional school day. This potentially allows room for different learning experiences or differentiated pacing to create flexibility for individual students. Utah also built on its foundation for personalized competency-based learning in 2022 by approaching local flexibility from a couple of different angles. The legislature established a grant program to support innovative class schedules or curriculum. In addition to the funding component that Emily highlighted earlier, the legislation establishes a novel state policy approach that specifically permits teachers to apply to operate an opportunity classroom. Through this legislation, teachers are able to exercise more autonomy to personalize instruction at the class level, and it really kind of shrinks down the model of the innovation school to that individual class level. The legislature also adopted a more common state policy option by allowing schools to submit an innovation plan to the state board for approval. Plans may include requests for waivers from state board rules that might inhibit innovative instructional models. The state board is also tasked with continuous oversight of innovation schools to ensure that the plan is really having its intended effect. The local flexibilities provided in these bills opens the door for innovation that can be designed specifically for the needs of students and communities, while also still complying with state accountability requirements. So now that we've covered these key trends, I'm going to pass it to Emily to close out our discussion with a few policies to keep an eye on in the coming years.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So as we were pulling bill examples, we realized that there were a handful of bills that didn't pass or were still pending or passed after we pulled examples and trends that would be game changers in the student-centered learning space. So here are 3 examples that felt especially germane to the work of the student-centered learning community that we wanted to flag for our audience of this webinar. First, we wanted to highlight an education omnibus bill in Missouri. This bill has passed through both chambers, but is still awaiting the governor's signature. And it includes the Show Me Success Diploma program and an associated grant program that were both initially proposed in Senate Bill 660. It also maintains the proposed establishment of a task force on competency-based education. And the task force is instructed to work towards implementing competency-based education courses statewide and devising a plan for Missouri to lead the way in competency-based education courses. The bill also includes instructions on how the state will determine funding allocation through the funding formula for students enrolled in competency-based education courses. And finally, it includes a program for schools of innovation. Like I said, this is an education omnibus bill if I've ever seen one. And it includes a lot of recommendations from a working group that the department formed to discuss competency-based education. So I think this is nice, and I think it's a nice and kind of rare example of a linear and intentional policy development. And also be sure to keep an eye out for the governor's signature on this bill. In Pennsylvania, a proposed bill would have established a student-centered assessment pilot program. And this bill didn't see a lot of action this legislative session as it didn't move through either chamber, but there were some interesting pieces that we thought our audience might like to hear about. Specifically, the bill would have established the use of adaptive testing, which includes testing opportunities throughout the year and a focus on student data to help identify progress. And even though this bill didn't have momentum, it's evidence that there are these conversations happening in the state around student-centered assessments. So that's really exciting to see. And finally, we wanted to highlight the budget bill in South Carolina, which includes a proviso that would enable competency-based learning at the school level. The bill includes the policy around competency-based learning that was initially proposed in House Bill 3883. The budget bill was enacted on June 15th, so it didn't make our initial selection of bills for this presentation, but we wanted to flag it nonetheless. And the reason this bill is important is because currently, districts can apply to have some, but not all schools in their district provide competency-based learning. And this bill creates greater ease then for schools interested in offering competency-based learning programs and ultimately enables greater accessibility to these programs for students. Although I should note that the proviso is only for a single year. And now I will pass it to John so that we can transition to the Q&A portion of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Emily and Ben. And you all covered a lot of ground. So for the Q&A, just so we're not staring at slides while we're doing it, I'm going to go off of slide share and then we'll come back at the end. But as folks are thinking through questions that they may have, we again just wanted to emphasize, I can't speak for Ben on his end, but I know at KnowledgeWorks, we tracked over 230 separate bills this session, and clearly we couldn't highlight all of them in this presentation in and of itself. So would love any questions or clarifications folks may have. But as we're waiting for any questions to come in, I will ask one question to both of you. Were there any areas or trends that you maybe found surprising or perhaps not surprising given both of your history doing bill tracking?
Yeah, I think Emily has covered this well around funding. So we know every year states are passing their big funding bills, whether it's a big budget bill or grant programs or whatever it might be. But I think one thing that stood out were pretty big changes in Tennessee and Vermont to their actual funding formulas, in conversations around changing student counts and how money is appropriated based on student needs. And I think this stood out as a surprise from my end because it is very difficult to build up the political momentum to change a funding formula, to get enough buy-in, to bring enough people to the table to actually make these big changes. So we're going to be following this in the coming years as well. It seems like there's more and more interest around creating more of these student-centered funding systems. And I think our student counts brief really highlights some of those recent trends as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, John. Ben, I like what you said about funding a lot. I think a couple areas, I think kind of these weren't really surprises. Like equity wasn't a surprise given kind of the state of the world and the results that happened from the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw that really disproportionately impacted learners. And so I think we're seeing a lot of states looking at legislation to more equitably support learners coming out of the large waves of that pandemic. I think one thing that was kind of surprising for me was the student learning pathways. And just because at KnowledgeWorks, I think that we tend to focus on more K-12 policies, that we're starting to expand out of that. And so it's just kind of like a smaller bucket. So that means that there was a lot of really interesting legislative activity going on there. So that was exciting.
Yeah, and somewhat aligned with the learning pathways, I guess, as states are rethinking these options for students, I don't think it was surprising that we're starting to see more and more movement around assessment and accountability. I know a lot of states have been asking us here at ECS about what other states are doing for their assessment policies, how they're amending their accountability systems, because we're not that far removed from states developing their ESSA plans, but obviously the COVID-19 pandemic really threw a wrench in state accountability systems. So as they're thinking, or as they're restarting that accountability clock, like the U.S. Department of Ed is requiring, we're really interested in seeing how they might tweak their accountability systems to develop different measures for school performance. We're really interested in how they might leverage assessment to not only evaluate school performance, but also provide more actionable data as well, like we touched on the assessment of mastery slide.
Right. Thank you both. And it looks like we've had a couple of questions come in the chat. So first one, I'm just kind of not processing these in any particular order. And I know this wasn't a topic that we touched on, but I'll figure, Ben, I know that ECS is very expansive in its bill tracking. Emily, I'm sure you may have seen some of this too. Amy asked us, are there any trends that you all saw in relation to affordable, reliable internet investments, especially as it relates to virtual learning for personalized learning, that you could highlight?
Amy, that's a really fun question for me, because when I was at ECS, I tracked technology and broadband access. So there were a bunch of bills in like 2020, 2021 that focused on just this. It was about hotspots for students and providing devices. A lot of it was centered within like the context of students learning virtually under COVID-19. But we are those programs are continuing through. And so while it wasn't like a trending topic, because we didn't see the volume that we saw the couple of sessions earlier, it's definitely something that states are still looking at. Oh, yes. And that's a great brief that Ben just dropped in.
Yeah, thank you so much on that, Ben. Ben, I know we had another question from Mark, but before we jump onto that, just wanted to ask you, I think you talked about this a bit in your first answer, but ECS has been tracking, issues, like you said, since 1996. So just curious, based on previous sessions, how would you characterize some of the change in interest in some of these topics related to personalized learning over time? Has it increased? Is it about the same? Like, where's it going?
Yeah, I think we touched on finance and assessment and accountability, but we're also seeing more and more states take another look at their graduation requirements to think about different options they may be able to provide. And this was a trend that we started to notice prior to the pandemic. I know Colorado developed their menu of options for local graduation requirements, but we've seen states like Oregon kind of put a hold on certain requirements, and they've developed or convened a task force to reconsider some. I think Kansas has taken a look at their graduation requirements as well. And it seems like there's been an uptick in states thinking about personalizing their graduation requirements or creating different options. And along this same line, I think states are having kind of the parallel conversation around pathways through high school and into post-secondary. And we've seen states like Tennessee establish new pathways, but we're also seeing a state push to encourage partnerships between the K-12 system and the post-secondary system, whether it's through more traditional approaches like concurrent and dual enrollment, or carving out more innovative opportunities. One of my colleagues who covers workforce here also mentioned to me that states are really trying to localize some of these pathways, where they're encouraging partnerships between employers and other workforce entities in their region with schools to help kind of meet some of the workforce demands, to prepare students to pick the right path for them, be it post-secondary education, be it entering the workforce. So I think these are consistent trends, but we've seen more and more of a push, especially out of the COVID-19 pandemic and kind of the realization that a lot of states are coming to around creating these different options for students. And then specific to personalized competency-based learning, from our perspective, we're seeing more and more legislative action, especially in terms of grant funding or pilot programs. We're seeing states create these flexibilities through innovation schools, or I think Utah's opportunity classroom policy approach will be an interesting one to follow moving forward, to see if other states adopt it as well. And I guess finally, I think Emily touched on mental health. Like, more and more states are recognizing the importance of whole child education, addressing the mental health needs of students in order for them to really truly be prepared to learn and actively participate in this academic setting as well. But yeah, I guess short answer to your question, we noticed some of these things prior to the pandemic, and we're seeing more and more movement coming out of the pandemic as states kind of think about, I guess, what the new normal is.
Great. Thanks for that overview, Ben. So I know we did get a couple of questions. Thank you from Mark in the chat about thinking about states that are really serving as great models for student-centered learning, that are maybe thinking about how they can formally move all their schools towards student-centered learning policy. Happy to provide some examples. And I think, one thing that I'll definitely say is that the model that a lot of states have really taken is, on some level, a coalition of the willing approach of, we want to put the conditions in place. We really want to encourage and support schools that are doing this, but it's very much an optional thing, and really allowing schools and districts the time and the space to pursue these types of innovations. So all that said, there are fortunately a wide range of great states that are doing some wonderful systemic actions. Looking back a little bit further, some states that have been doing this for a while now. You have states like New Hampshire, which eliminated the credit hour at one point, and credits are based on competency. You have states like Vermont, Rhode Island, and Idaho that have a lot of systems and structures in place to allow for this sort of systemic approach. Some of the states that KnowledgeWorks works in specifically, you have states like South Carolina and North Dakota, which have established things like portraits of a graduate and learning continuums that really interline competencies, allow schools and districts to then take those frameworks and then turn them into student-centered approaches and practice for education. We're also doing some work in Nevada right now with a whole state effort to really help the state and schools and districts think about how they can, more schools can transition to student-centered learning approaches. And then I also know we don't work there as much, but Washington, I know we have some Washington folks, I think, on the webinar, and Utah folks as well. Both of those states are doing some great work through their state boards of education to really advance student-centered learning. And I really do want to call out one last example that Emily brought up in her other bills. We were really excited when we saw the Senate Bill 681 in Missouri. And I think Emily already highlighted this, but the package of reforms that they put together is really a great example of that systemic type of effort to really try to not just have a one-off small innovation program, but really think statewide, how can a state put together the infrastructure to support these kinds of things? Emily or Ben, anything else that you guys want to add on that question?
Well, that was a really long list. I feel bad adding on to it, but I just want to also highlight, like you mentioned, Utah has so many great resources as schools and districts want to start transitioning into this work. They have a grant for planning, which I think is really, really important. And I think we've sort of seen in South Carolina, they're also sort of their their Office of Personalized Learning is really starting to develop kind of similar policy guidance documents to make it easy for schools and districts to start to transition to this model of education. And I think guidance documents that make it easy for leaders to understand what to do and how to do it, and providing any available dollars to support that work are two critical components as we start to transition to more personalized competency-based learning across the board.
I think you all nailed it. I think we'll all hold off on plugging a future ECS KnowledgeWorks resource that will kind of cover to close the session.
And the last thing I'll just flag for Mark and others who may be interested, we actually did a webinar on this a couple of weeks back, but there was a report that we worked with a group called Research for Action on that really looked for how have some states, and there are a number of the ones that I just highlighted here, been translating the state commitment to district implementation? And I'll drop the link here in the chat. So this, I believe this is, correct me if I'm wrong, I am two folks who are on the call, but this may be one of the first, if not the first report of its kind to really look at how do you go from state policy to district implementation. So hopefully this is also helpful in response to that question. All right, I think we have one more. Emily, wondering if you could, tell us a bit about, there was a lot of policy happening at the state legislature. What else might you have been seeing outside of the legislature that, to Mark's question, has been advancing PCBL given your role at KnowledgeWorks?
Yeah, so personalized competency-based learning happens kind of in different areas of the state. A lot of it's at the implementation level. A lot of it can be driven by the Department of Education in a state. And so I think it's really important for our work to not just look at legislative trends. And so, I mean, a couple different states that pop up when I think about this question is, like I mentioned, South Carolina is doing a bunch of work. Their department has kind of been leading in the work of personalized competency-based learning since Superintendent Spearman established the Office of Personalized Learning. And like their department developed the profile of the graduate, which is really the first step in visioning. And then they're, like I mentioned, working on policy guidance documents to help expand the use of flexibilities that exist within the state. And they also, as we mentioned, are working with the state legislature to change state statutes so that they can have competency-based education through all schools, for all schools in a district, because currently that is not the way it's set up in their state. I think that another place where the department is doing a lot of really interesting work is in Kentucky. And right now, their department is facilitating discussions with a group to examine new and innovative assessment and accountability tactics that'll support PCBL education. And this working group is not only exploring ways that they can do this within like under current state statute, but also are sort of thinking about ways that they could recommend that the legislature make changes. So it's sort of like these two sides have to work together, to make these policies really work.
Great, thank you so much for that, Emily. It's a great overview of some of those other state actions. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and transition to our closeout. So first, Ben and Emily, thank you both for this great presentation today and all of the work that went into prepping for it, all of the bills. I don't even want to speculate at the number of hours that you both have spent wading through statutory and legislative text to really prep for this. But as Emily articulated earlier in this webinar, I really just want to emphasize that we are both here, ECS and KnowledgeWorks, to help you with any questions you may have related to legislative tracking or policy in general. So you can see our emails up there on the screen. Feel free to write them down, reach out. I think I probably speak for all three of us when I say that favorite part of our day is when we get a question from someone at the state level on what's going on with policy and some way that we can help out. So please always feel free to reach out. One thing I really want to emphasize before we go to is just kind of tying together all the pieces of this webinar. You'll notice that we took a very expansive look on what really goes into the idea of personalized learning. So, at KnowledgeWorks, we really think about the systemic approach, that it's not just about opportunities to, for example, take on innovative pilots or innovation zones. We also really need to make sure that schools and districts are able to put in place the supports and create the opportunities that really facilitate this type of innovation in the first place. And if you check out, again, our 12-part state policy framework that was shared in the chat earlier, you'll really see the very expansive view that we take of what really needs to be encompassed in that. So you may remember too that Emily mentioned that we had 230 different bills that we tracked at KnowledgeWorks. So we didn't want to get into it here, since I think, as Emily and Ben highlighted very well, that we take a slightly different approach to tracking than ECS. But for folks who are interested, Emily published a legislative session recap not too long ago that includes includes not only a breakdown of some more examples of the types of bills that we found really interesting, but it also has a great visual that goes into the specific number of bills in each of our 12 policy conditions. So if that's something that you're interested in learning a bit more about, how all these bills broke down and what was introduced, feel free to check that out. A great resource that we just wanted to make sure to share before leaving. And one last great resource that Ben alluded to. So one exciting announcement. So ECS is going to be having their annual convening in July on the 13th through the 15th in Washington, D.C. And in advance of that convening, where we are also going to be doing some personalized learning work, we wanted to let you all know that we are going to be releasing a joint brief on personalized competency-based learning. This brief is going to include a 50-state scan of policies related to implementation of personalized competency-based learning, and answers questions such as what states have profiles of a graduate, pilot programs, competencies, competency-based assessments, among many other topics. So we really hope that this will serve as a valuable resource to policy leaders across the country, and we cannot wait to share it with you all. So with that, I just want to thank everyone for attending today. Since we're ending a little earlier, we can definitely stay on for a couple of minutes in case folks have any last questions that may have popped up since the Q&A. But as always, and as I already mentioned, please never hesitate to reach out if there's anything that either of our organizations can do to help out. Again, like I said earlier, I know I speak for all of us, and I say that getting questions from you all is the best part of our day. So with that, thank you so much, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you all again soon.